today we had Jerome Powell speak, and basically from what he stated was that rate cuts are coming. He didn't clarify if it's going to be 25 or 50 basis points in September, but basically for the fact that inflation is slowing down, we're going to get to our 2% target, so on and so forth, and that rate cuts are coming. So that is a good green light, basically in terms of reaffirming to the market that they are getting what they want, essentially for the most part. But yeah, so there's that portion. Now in this video, I'm going to be covering the whole entire market in terms of Dow Jones, Nasdaq, and S&P 500, including the economic calendar. Now I do post these videos daily, so I highly encourage you to double check the latest video on my channel, so that way you get the most updated information. And before I get to the technical analysis portion, I'm going to go over the economic calendar. And for Monday, August 26, 2024 at 8:30 a.m., we have durable goods orders, as well as durable goods minus transportation. And at 2 p.m., we have San Francisco Fed President Daly TV interview. Now, one thing to note too, also by the end of the week of next week's trading week, we have PCE inflation numbers, which is somewhat relatively important, even though the Fed stated that interest rates are coming. But this would probably give a little bit more of a better picture in terms of if we'll see 25 or 50 basis points. The reason why this is a little bit important, again, more than versus CPI and PPI, is the PCE inflation numbers are regarded as more accurate to the Feds in terms of data versus the CPI and PPI inflation numbers. So there's that. So be on the lookout for the end of trading week. And then also one thing I should note is NVIDIA is reporting earnings on Wednesday. It is expected to be a beat. And at the same time, given that NVIDIA is a mega cap stock in the trillions, I believe it's a little over 3 trillion. And I'm going to check while I'm looking at that. Yeah, $3.18 trillion. And if it does move up favorably, then there's a good chance it might pull the markets up to the upside. And we are on some critical levels for some of the markets in terms of, or not necessarily markets, but some of the S&P, for example, Nasdaq and Dow Jones, because, for example, the S&P is nearing the all-time high and including the Dow Jones. The Nasdaq is not quite there yet, but it will get there in time if everything gets pulled up at the same time overall, if that makes sense. Now, first I'm going to cover S&P, then I'm going to get to the Dow Jones and Nasdaq and so on and so forth. So I'm going to be looking at ETF SPY, which is an ETF for the S&P 500. So same thing, just different ratio. Closed at $562.13, nearing all-time highs. Essentially, this was all-time highs. If I zoom out right about here to the all graph, you can see all-time highs, so on and so forth. And the question is, are we going to pass it? Now, in terms of based off MAC lines, in terms of, for example, just in case you're new to the channel, MAC lines indicate if we're in a bearish or bullish movement. And currently, we are more into the trajectory to the upside for the time being. And given that, plus anticipation for NVIDIA shares, I'm assuming the share price will rise up leading up to Wednesday potentially. Not a guaranteed, but I think there's a good chance. If that's the case, gets pulled up, then we will pass all-time highs, essentially between the $564 and some change, $565 and some change if you count the pre-market and after hours in terms of the all-time highs. So good chance we'll pass it, and if we pass, then we're off to the races basically for the most part. Not necessarily off to the races completely, but a decent upside. Now, if we do get pulled down and the market is not necessarily feeling to go to the upside fully based off of NVIDIA, rate cuts, so on and so forth, and maybe somewhat scared for the PC inflation numbers by the end of the trading week, then we could start trickling down. We could probably come down to the moving average, which is about $559 and some change, and coincides with some drops. So if visually, I'll draw right about here. You could see horizontally right about here is decent amount of support bounce offs and resistance. So that could play a good toll in terms of support, just because the moving average is right there as well at the same level. And then the next level, I would argue, is probably the next moving average, was about $557 and some change. And then, in my opinion, this would be the lowest, this drop right about here, which would be $555 and some change. There is potential support at the $557 and some change, which is pretty much where the moving average is as well. But the $555 and some change, in my opinion, would hold us. I don't expect to go any lower. Just because, again, leading up to NVIDIA earnings being reported, mega cap stock, plus rate cuts coming, plus PC inflation numbers, I don't think the market's necessarily too scared about it because, again, from what Jerome Powell stated today, market's doing well in terms of inflation being reduced and getting to that 2% inflation target. So I don't expect any surprises, but who knows, the market could be scared sometimes, right? Now, in terms of the Dow Jones, I'm going to actually cover first, and then I'm going to cover the Nasdaq. So for Dow Jones, we closed at 41,175 points. We got to the higher up limit that I mentioned earlier in the last video. And then basically to go to the all-time highs, it's essentially for the most part 41,400 points. I expect to either get close to it or pass it. for the early part of the trading week, specifically Monday potentially. Again, because I think the momentum is going to be more for the upside based off MAC lines, NVIDIA shares, NVIDIA stock, so on and so forth. But if we do come down, we could potentially come down to this downward trend resistance line that could act as support. We saw it bounce off it earlier as well, 2 times. So that's pretty much, and plus colliding with the moving average, you're looking at about 40,800 points, give or take. Or if we do come down even further, in my opinion, the lowest we would come down to either where the moving averages are, which is pretty much around 40,000 points to 40,200 points, give or take, 250 points actually. So 40,000 into 40,250. And that 40,000 is about 40,050 for the most part, but I think that moving average would get moved down anyway for the most part. But in my opinion, this is the lowest right about here. So this upward trend resistance line that could act as support dates back since 2021. Right about here, we have multiple touch points, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then more touch points here. And then these two break down to 2 additional touch points when you see further. So for example, right about here, they break down to 2 additional touch points. So clearly it is resistance. Potentially, arguably, it is support too, because you kind of see a support bounce off about 2 right there, and arguably maybe a third, but that hits more of the moving average personally. And if that is the case, we come down, you could be looking at potentially support at roughly about 40,450 points, give or take. And that's the lowest in my opinion. Again, this is just my opinion, so please do your own due diligence and research before buying and selling. But I don't expect to go any lower because, again, the momentum for the markets in terms of based on MAC lines, expectation for rate cut, everything seems positive in terms of what the Fed stated, in terms of rate cuts are coming, plus NVIDIA shares, and so on and so forth, expecting a beat. So mega cap stock moving up, markets going up in general. Not guaranteed, but I think the momentum will be carried. Now, if we go to Nasdaq, I'm going to be looking at ETF QQQ, which is the ETF for Nasdaq, and it's just same thing, just different ratio and all that stuff. Now, currently, where we're stuck at is this upward trend resistance line dates back since 2010, and I think early part of the next trading week will pass it personally, because again, what I stated previously. So in case you're new to the channel, upward trend resistance line dating back since 2010. Mind you, the markets did go up. It's not that it's not going up. It's just the fact that it was basically stuck underneath the whole entire time. Every single time it went up, it just got knocked down. It did pass in 2020 to 2022, but then came back underneath it and then had troubles passing it once again as of recent, and then did pass it, but then we came back underneath it. I know there's too much lines. I should start deleting soon, but the problem is some of them are still in play, unfortunately. So upward trend resistance line right about here. We passed it. I believe inflation numbers came out during this time right about here, and then came back underneath it, and then now we're arguably still stuck underneath it again now. So this is the line. Had issues passing it, false breakout, came back underneath it, and then had issues passing again. I believe that was right at the opening or pre-market, that spike. And then the question is, are we going to pass it? Now, if we do pass it, we're going to have arguably issues passing it once again at the level of about $483 some change, 484. And then the next level of potential resistance could be about the 485 and some change. But ultimately, I think, in my opinion, this level will be causing us issues about the 487 and some change. And if the momentum picks up quite significantly, I would expect this level to be about $490 and some change. Could we go higher? Obviously, we can. I just don't expect the movement to be that crazy for the time being for the early part of the next trading week, more specifically the Monday. If we do pass, it would be more the Tuesday or the Wednesday we pass about the 490 and some change. I don't expect the Monday to pass the 490 and some change personally. But that's that. And then once that happens, we're going to be testing the all-time highs, just like the Dow Jones and Nasdaq. And just to visually show, all-time highs for Nasdaq, so on and so forth. So we're pretty much right there. It's not as close versus the S&P and Nasdaq, or the S&P and Dow Jones. Now, to the downside, I expect, in my opinion, decent support. We've seen multiple times bounce off, a little bit more of a dip there, but essentially bounce off there as well, resistance. And then we saw resistance, somewhat consolidation right there, and a bounce off if I extend the line. So pretty much about $474 and some change, we could expect to see support. We do have the moving average zone right about here, about the 480 and some change and 478 and some change. And then on the downside, you could expect support where the moving average is, plus coincides where the resistance is, roughly about $465 and some change. And then the utmost lowest, in my opinion, I don't expect to go any lower than this if we were to drop down significantly, 460 and some change. And what I mean by that is more for like the Monday and Tuesday trading day personally, just because there is quite a bit of good support in terms of resistance support, plus it passes the moving average. I don't expect to go that much. It would just be a sling drop and then go back up to the upside drastically. But that's basically it for today's video. Hopefully you found it beneficial. If you did, consider dropping a like. It does help with the channel, so thank you so much for that. I do appreciate it. And I do post these videos daily, so I highly encourage you to follow and subscribe if you want to be notified when I upload my next video. And that's all. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate it. Take care. God bless and peace.